The Blackburn Dart was a torpedo bomber that was developed for the Fleet Air Arm in the early 1920s. Following the end of the First World War, Britain's main torpedo bomber was the Sopwith Cuckoo, and the Navy was very happy with it. Indeed, its good performance and handling had convinced them to plan an ambitious torpedo attack on the German fleet in 1919, but the Armistice of November 1918 scuppered these plans of what could have been the World War I equivalent of the raid on Pearl Harbor. But as good as the Cuckoo was, the rapid advances being made in aircraft development meant that it would probably become obsolete within a few years. Thus, despite heavily reduced peacetime budgets, the Navy sought out the next generation of torpedo bomber, lest the Americans, the French, or the Italians gain the technological lead. The result was the disappointing short shell and the flying matchbox that was the Blackburn Blackbird. Neither of these entered production, and the Navy was forced to reissue its torpedo bomber requirements, hoping that this time they might actually receive a submission worth their interest. Major F. A. Bumpus, who had designed the disappointing Blackbird, was aware that Blackburn's reputation was at risk, and indeed it was already somewhat checkered, and even before the Blackbird had been rejected, he had begun work on a more promising design. The result was the Blackburn T1 Swift. The prototype was built in just 5 months, and it was far enough along to be displayed at the Olympia Aero Show, albeit with a fake radiator and no installed controls, but those were minor quibbles. It was instantly apparent that the Swift was going to be a notable improvement over the old, failed Blackbird. It featured a more rugged airframe to deal with the stresses of carrier-borne operations, with the central fuselage, the top wing center section, the lower wing roots, and the undercarriage frames being integrated into a single rigid structure. All the necessary fittings were machined out of solid metal. The nose had a newly designed and detachable engine mounting, which significantly reduced the time taken to swap out power plants, and it had the distinction of being the first British aircraft that had folded wings which were also staggered. Another benefit over the Blackbird could be found in the Swift's undercarriage. The Blackbird had a fixed axle undercarriage, which had to be jettisoned for a torpedo to be launched, but the Swift featured a divided undercarriage, which was quite the innovation for the time, and this allowed it to launch a Mark 7 or a Mark 9 torpedo without throwing away its precious wheels. That being said, the undercarriage could still be jettisoned in an emergency, as they posed something of a risk when ditching in the sea, as the wheels would dig into the water and threaten to flip the whole aircraft over onto its back. Powered by a 450 horsepower Napier Lion W12, the Swift made its first flight in September of 1920, and then, like many early prototypes of this era designed on new principles, it immediately tried to kill its test pilot. R.W. Kenworthy, who was testing the Swift, was disturbed to find that he had pretty much zero elevator control. Even with the control column pushed right forward, the Swift still tried to climb. Thankfully, Kenworthy was able to regain some control by almost fully closing the throttle and applying a little rudder, and then, after a long, sweeping circuit of the airfield, he was able to bring the aircraft down for a slightly bumpy landing, although nothing serious was broken. The problem was that the centre of mass was not where Blackburn engineers had expected, and the solution to the problem was surprisingly simple. F. A. Bumpus added a few degrees of sweepback to the wings, which brought the centre of lifting pressure closer to the centre of gravity, and thus the problem was solved. Following this change, the flight tests were completed without incident, after which Blackburn was invited to send the prototype over to Martlesham Heath. There, it would conduct further tests, including naval exercises using torpedoes, and it would be evaluated against another promising design being developed by Handley Page. During these tests, which concluded in January of 1921, the only major change that was made to the Swift was the redesign of the rudder, which had proven to be ineffective when the aircraft was fully loaded with its torpedoes and other military equipment. Flight tests with the new rudder proved wholly satisfactory, and following carrier trials aboard HMS Argus in April, which were also fully successful, and in which the Swift also trialled an early version of the arrestor gear, the Navy placed an order for 3 service test units. These would be delivered as the Blackburn Dart, with the name Swift being reserved for export models of the same design. The first of these 3 service aircraft made its maiden flight in October 1921, and the last was completed by February of the following year. Compared to the prototype, these aircraft only differed noticeably in 2 ways. They had an updated version of the Napier Lion engine, the Mark IIB, and the wingspan was slightly reduced. This was requested by the Navy so that carrier operations and storage could be made easier. The Blackburn Dart was then put through a full performance evaluation against the competing Handley Page HP-19. Unfortunately, not much is known about how they matched up, but the Blackburn design was apparently superior, as the Dart was the one to receive a full production order. This initial contract was for 26 aircraft, and the first were delivered to the Fleet Air Arm in March of 1922. For a single-engine aircraft, the Dart was unusually large, at least for its time. It had a wingspan of 45 feet 6 inches, or 13.8 meters, a length of 35 feet 4 inches, or 10.7 meters, and a height of 12 feet 11 inches, or 3.9 meters. Fully loaded, it weighed approximately 6,380 pounds, or 2.9 tons, and it was rated to carry a single 18-inch torpedo or a pair of 520-pound bombs. This meant that although it actually had a slightly smaller wingspan than the preceding Sopwith Cuckoo, it was longer, and it weighed almost twice as much. Now, this bulk, combined with some deeply unflattering looks, something of a hallmark for early Blackburn designs in fact, made the pilot officers of various Fleet Air Arm torpedo units somewhat uneasy. But they would in fact be pleasantly surprised. Despite its looks, the Blackburn Dart was a pleasure to fly. It had remarkably low wing loading of just 9 pounds per square foot, and it had a stalling speed of just 38 knots. This made it very ideal for carrier operations, and it was very forgiving in the hands of new and inexperienced pilots. In more experienced hands, the Dart was equally pleasant to work with. It handled nimbly for its size, could absorb a remarkable amount of punishment from hard landings in rough weather, and it could manage the heavy 18-inch torpedoes with relative ease. The Dart first entered service in early 1924, with early units joining numbers 460 and 461 Fleet Torpedo Flight aboard the carriers HMS Eagle and HMS Furious. They also equipped Training Flight D, which taught naval pilots the techniques of torpedo bomber operations. When production of the Dart ceased in 1928, approximately 117 had been produced for the Royal Navy, plus an additional 8 export models, which went to Japan, Spain, and the United States. Like many early interwar aircraft, the Dart service life was one of peace, but this did not mean its service was insignificant. Indeed, compared to some other British military aircraft of this time, the Dart ranks quite highly. Its ruggedness and reliability enabled the Fleet Air Arm to develop and perfect its torpedo-dropping techniques. This was during a time when carrier operations were still in their infancy and risks were exceedingly high. Having a dependable and, above all else, stable aircraft gave the pilots of HMS Courageous, Eagle, and Furious the confidence to strive for constant improvement. This led to several startling performances in various fleet and air exercises, with the best example being the theoretical sinking of the battleships Nelson and Rodney by 15 darts off the Isle of Wight in a training exercise in September of 1930. Not only did the Dart form the backbone of the fleet's torpedo bombing force in the earlier part of the decade, but it also pioneered the operation of carrier aircraft by night. On the 1st of July 1926, a Blackburn Dart flown by Flight Lieutenant Gerald Boyce performed the first nighttime landing aboard an aircraft carrier, touching down aboard HMS Furious. Within a couple of years, the challenges of nighttime operations had been more or less overcome, and a few Dart units would be painted in nighttime camouflage, becoming the first naval air units where flying by night would be their modus operandi. The majority of these night-flying darts would serve aboard HMS Courageous, and they would spend much of their time with the Mediterranean fleet in the early 1930s. For an early interwar design, the Dart remained in service for quite some time. The Fleet Air Arm did not begin to retire its units until early 1933, with the Dart being replaced by the Blackburn Ripon and Baffin, and overseas the type had evolved to enjoy modest success with the Greek Navy. The Dart had been redesigned into the Blackburn T3 Velos, which was essentially a two-seat version which was often operated as a seaplane for coastal defence. It carried more advanced equipment than the Dart, including a rear-mounted Lewis gun, and it was designed with nighttime operations as its primary function. Several of these were produced for the Greeks by Blackburn themselves, but at least 12 aircraft were produced by the Greeks under license. The Greek models differed slightly in that the rear cockpit was slightly raised. This was because earlier tests with the Velos had revealed that the rear gun had a very poor field of fire in its original location, and they entered service in 1926. Although they did not have a particularly exciting service life, the Velos were important as they gave the Greeks vital experience in the production of domestic aircraft. Additionally, despite the additional weight of the various modifications, these aircraft still maintained the good handling performance that had made the Blackburn Dart so popular. Because of this, the Velos would remain in service even longer than the Blackburn Dart, with the last units not being retired until 1936. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and a big thank you of course to the patrons. Like the previous video, this one is being recorded before I go away to visit my family, so if there are any changes to this patron list, they will be reflected in the next video that will be released after I get back. A big thank you, of course, to our Wing Commander tier patrons, our highest tier supporters. Now, I've got a mix of videos planned for March, a couple of long ones, a smattering of shorter ones, and a special interview, which I'm hoping will be ready by mid-month, so hopefully that is something to look forward to. But as always, thank you for your continued support, and I will catch you all next time. Goodbye.